Most strokes don't kill you. They erase you, slowly. Most people think a stroke ends when you leave the hospital. But the truth is far more terrifying. The real danger, the force that steals movement, rewires personality, and decides who recovers, begins after the stroke is over. Your body survives the attack, but your brain is now fighting a war you cannot see. Imagine you try to lift your hand to pick up a cup of coffee. It is something you have done 1,000,000 times. You send the signal, but there is only silence. The arm does not feel heavy or tired. It feels foreign, like it belongs to someone else. We once believed that paralysis after stroke was permanent, but we were wrong. Your brain is not fixed in stone. It can reroute, rebuild, and rewire itself around the damage. Today, we are going deep into the science of how movement returns after a stroke, and I am going to show you that journey through the story of a man named Elias, because understanding how recovery works is the single strongest predictor of actually achieving it. To understand recovery, we first have to understand the crash. Let me introduce you to Elias. Elias is 55 years old, a master carpenter who has worked with his hands his entire life. One Tuesday morning, he was sanding a table when his right arm simply dropped. He tried to lift it, and he fell. Inside Elias's brain, a tiny blood clot had lodged itself in the middle cerebral artery. This artery supplies blood to the motor cortex. Think of the motor cortex as the grand piano player of your body. It hits the keys that make your muscles move. When that blood clot hit, the music stopped. The neurons in that specific area, starved of oxygen, began to die within minutes. This resulted in what we call hemiplegia, or paralysis on one side of the body. But the moment that clot blocked the artery, something far more catastrophic was unfolding, silently, microscopically. The neurons in the motor cortex did not simply lose blood. They entered a biochemical freefall we call the ischemic cascade. Without oxygen and glucose, the brain's energy currency, ATP, collapsed within minutes. The sodium-potassium pumps shut down. Water rushed into the cells. Glutamate exploded across the synapses like an electrical storm. Calcium flooded in, triggering enzymes that began digesting the neurons from the inside out. At the center of this event, the tissue died almost instantly. That is the ischemic core. But surrounding it was a much more important territory, the penumbra. This zone was injured, yet still alive, electrically silent, yet salvageable. And the size of this penumbra would determine how much of Elias's body could be reclaimed, and how much would be lost forever. But here is the crucial thing to remember. While the neurons in the core of the stroke may be lost, the rest of the brain is alive. It is confused, it is in shock, but it is waiting for instructions. Elias woke up in the hospital, unable to move his right side, terrified that his life as a carpenter was over. But his brain was already preparing for a battle he did not know how to fight yet. The first phase of this battle is often deceptive. The muscles are loose and floppy. But lurking just beneath the surface, a different problem is brewing, one that can freeze the limb permanently if we are not careful. But the MRI never shows the whole story. What Elias did not know was that the stroke had stunned much more than the damaged area. When one region of the brain shuts down, the areas connected to it also go dark. This phenomenon is called diaschisis, a kind of neural shock wave. The cerebellum, the thalamus, Even the opposite hemisphere can temporarily lose their function simply because their partner region went offline. This is why Elias's paralysis looked worse than the size of the clot would suggest. His brain was not only injured, it was confused. And over the next few weeks, as this shock gradually lifted, pieces of movement would begin to flicker back like lights turning on in a recovering city. But the worst silence after a stroke is not in the limb. It is in the brain itself, waiting to see which circuits will wake back up. For the first few weeks, Elias experienced what we call flaccidity. His arm hung loose. This is often called the shock phase. The brain has temporarily shut down communication lines due to inflammation. During this time, something incredible happens naturally. It is called spontaneous biological recovery. As the swelling in the brain goes down and the inflammation clears, some movement might flicker back. Elias noticed he could twitch his shoulder just a tiny bit. This is the golden window. However, this is also where the first trap appears. It is a phenomenon called learned nonuse. Because it is so hard to move the paralyzed arm, Elias naturally started doing everything with his good left arm. He brushed his teeth with his left hand and ate with his left hand. The brain is an efficiency machine. If you stop trying to use the bad arm, the brain will literally shrink the map of that arm in the motor cortex. It decides that the arm is no longer relevant business. To stop this, we have to force the issue. We have to tell the brain that this disconnected limb still matters. But how do you move a muscle that receives no signal? You have to trick the brain into seeing what is not there. If this helps you, hit like to help others find it. Now, let us get back to Elias and how he tricked his brain into healing. Sometimes the body does not wait for permission. It tries to move before the brain is ready, and that is when the real rewiring begins. To understand how Elias could ever regain movement, we must understand the highways of motion inside the brain. The main route is the corticospinal tract, the direct line from the motor cortex to the spinal cord. It controls precision, dexterity, and especially the fingers. When the stroke damaged this pathway, the signal to Elias's right arm was severed. But the brain has backup systems. Older pathways, like the reticulospinal tract, are less precise but more resilient. They carry commands for posture and broad movement. After a stroke, these ancient pathways can step forward, attempting to take over the lost functions of the damaged cortex. Recovery is not just about healing, it is about rerouting. It is about teaching the brain to build detours around a collapsed bridge. We are now entering the advanced mechanics of neuroplasticity. This is the medical term for the brain's ability to reorganize itself. Think of the stroke as a landslide blocking the main highway. The destination is your hand, but the road is destroyed. Neuroplasticity is the process of clearing a small dirt path through the forest around the landslide, and then driving over it thousands of times until it becomes a paved superhighway. And here is where neuroscience feels like magic. Elias began a therapy that feels like magic, but is grounded in neuroscience. It is called mirror therapy. We placed a mirror between his arms. He put his paralyzed right arm behind the mirror and his healthy left arm in front of it. When he looked into the mirror, he saw the reflection of his moving left arm, but his brain perceived it as his right arm moving perfectly. This visual illusion fires the mirror neurons in the damaged hemisphere of the brain. It wakes up the sleeping tissue. It reminds the brain what movement looks and feels like. Even though Elias could not physically move his right hand yet, his brain was practicing the movement. He also engaged in constraint-induced movement therapy. We placed a mitt on his good hand, essentially tying it behind his back for several hours a day. This was frustrating. It was exhausting. It forced Elias to use the paralyzed arm for everything. But this struggle is the signal the brain needs. It screams to the nervous system that we need that dirt path through the forest right now. But progress tests you. It slows, it resists, and it asks whether you will keep fighting. But as the movement started to return, Elias faced a new enemy. His arms stopped being floppy and started becoming tight, dangerously tight. Yet every victory in recovery awakens a new enemy. And the next one does not weaken the arm. It traps it. About 3 months in, Elias noticed his right arm was curling up against his chest. His fingers were clenching into a fist on their own. This is spasticity. The brain usually sends signals down to the spinal cord to tell muscles to move, but it also sends signals to tell them to relax. When the stroke damages those pathways, the relax signal gets lost. Without the brain's control, the spinal cord triggers constant contraction. For Elias, this was painful. It made rehab difficult because he had to fight his own stiffness. Elias felt betrayed by his own body. We treated this with a combination of stretching and medication to dampen those overactive signals. In some cases, doctors use botulinum toxin injections to relax specific muscles, creating a window of opportunity to strengthen the weak muscles underneath. It is crucial to understand that spasticity is actually a sign of life in the nervous system, but it is misdirected energy. We have to channel that energy into controlled movement. But then, the progress stopped. 6 months passed. Elias had regained the ability to lift his arm and open his hand, but he hit a wall. The progress slowed down. This is known as the plateau. This is the most dangerous time for a patient's mental health. Elias fell into a depression. He felt that this was as good as it was going to get. He stopped doing his exercises with intensity. Here is the truth about the plateau. It is not a biological dead end. It is an adaptation level. The easy gains are gone, and now the gains require 10 times the effort for 1% of the improvement. We introduced Elias to mental practice. Athletes use this all the time. We had Elias close his eyes and vividly visualize himself sanding a piece of wood. We hooked him up to sensors that showed his brain activity was almost identical whether he was imagining the action or doing it. He realized that recovery is not just physical, it is cognitive. By combining mental rehearsal with high-repetition physical practice, he broke through the plateau. He did not get his hand back to 100%, but he got it back to functional. Today, Elias is back in his workshop. He holds the sandpaper with his right hand. It is a little slower, and sometimes his thumb is stiff in the mornings. He has to be conscious of every movement. It is no longer fully automatic. But he is working. The takeaway is this. The brain is resilient, but it is demand-driven. It requires you to demand recovery from it. Whether you are 1 month post-stroke or 5 years post-stroke, neuroplasticity is still possible. The window never fully closes. It just gets heavier to push open. If you take one thing away from this video, let it be this. Movement is medicine. Every time you try to move, Even if nothing happens on the outside, you are building a bridge on the inside. If you want to know the specific exercises that trigger neuroplasticity, or the early warning signs of a stroke that can save your brain before damage happens, click the video on your screen right now. Do not wait. Knowledge is your best defense. I will see you there.